The village never truly recovered from the loss of its residents, their disappearances continuing to stir unease among those left behind. Each time a new face disappeared, another tale was added to the growing legend of Greystone Manor. But the manor itself, perched in solitude on the edge of the village, remained unchanged. It was a place that, once entered, seemed to swallow time itself, trapping its victims in a twisted reality where the rules of life and death no longer applied. No one could deny that something dark lingered in the air, something that bled into the very foundation of the house. But even the most horrifying places have a way of being forgotten, their terrors gradually dismissed or minimized until they become little more than whispers on the wind. And so, with time, the village fell into a kind of uneasy peace, the memory of the lost souls fading like ghosts in the daylight. The manor, however, never ceased to hunger. Years passed, and one cold autumn evening, a stranger arrived in the village. His name was Arthur, a man with a determined look in his eye, a scholar with an obsession for the supernatural. He had heard the rumors about Greystone Manor, but unlike the others, he wasn't afraid. He sought answers, the kind of answers that might reveal the truth behind the disappearances and the mysterious curse of the manor. A man of logic, of science, Arthur believed that if he could just find the right clues, the right patterns, he could uncover what lay at the heart of the manor's twisted power. He didn't waste time with the locals, dismissing their superstitions as unfounded fear. Instead, Arthur made his way to the manor under the cover of darkness, his mind racing with possibilities. He had heard the stories of the full moon, of the room that revealed itself only at night, of the strange blue glow that filled the air with a sense of dread. He was not here for the ghost stories. He was here to investigate, to study, to prove that there was a logical explanation for the horrors people believed they had seen. The gates of Greystone Manor creaked as he pushed them open, and the same silence that had greeted all those before him pressed against him. The wind, once still, now howled through the trees, a chilling sound that seemed to echo through the very bones of the house. The moon was full, its pale light casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. Arthur felt a slight twinge of unease as he crossed the threshold, but he brushed it aside. He had been to haunted places before. He had faced far more dangerous situations. He was prepared for whatever lay ahead. The interior of the manor was just as he had imagined, decayed, neglected, and shrouded in an oppressive darkness. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. There was an unsettling stillness to the house, as if it were waiting for something or someone. He moved carefully, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. And then, as if the manor were responding to his presence, a door creaked open at the end of the hall. A door he hadn't noticed before, one that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The door was old, its wood darkened by age, and it seemed to beckon him forward. The pull was undeniable, though Arthur wasn't sure if it was his curiosity or something deeper that urged him to approach. He couldn't help it. He had to see what lay beyond. He stepped forward, his hand gripping the cold doorknob. When he pushed the door open, a low hum filled the air, almost as if the room was alive, resonating with an energy that vibrated in his very chest. And there was the mirror. It stood taller than any mirror he had ever seen, its frame ornate and twisted, as though it had been forged in the deepest shadows. The blue light that poured from it bathed the room in an unnatural glow. The whispers, faint but distinct, filled the air around him, pulling at his thoughts, but Arthur's mind remained focused. He approached the mirror cautiously, studying it. The surface seemed to pulse, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shadow behind the glass. As he leaned in closer, something strange happened. The glass rippled like water, distorting the reflection before him. He blinked, unsure if it was his imagination or something more. The reflection wasn't his own. He wasn't even sure it was human. The figure in the glass moved with an unnatural fluidity, its face a twisted mask of anguish, eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at him. Arthur stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. A sudden coldness wrapped around him, as if the very air was freezing him in place. The room seemed to stretch, the walls bending and warping, the mirror's reflection expanding beyond its frame. It was as if the room was no longer confined to the space he had entered. It had become something else entirely. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They were no longer unintelligible murmurs, but words that rattled through his mind, creeping into his consciousness with every passing second. "You should not be here," the voice whispered, its tone both familiar and alien. "You were never meant to uncover the truth." Arthur spun around, but there was no one behind him. The room was empty, save for the mirror, which now seemed to shimmer with an ominous energy. His thoughts raced. He needed to leave, he needed to escape, but the door had vanished. It was as if the house itself was closing in on him, trapping him in this strange, shifting reality. Panic began to set in. The walls pressed closer, the air thickening with an oppressive force that made it difficult to breathe. He stumbled backward, his eyes locked on the mirror. And then, as though it were some grotesque parody of reality, the reflection shifted. The figure in the glass moved. No, it wasn't a reflection at all. The figure was real. It reached out with twisted fingers, breaking through the surface of the glass, its hand emerging from the mirror like a monstrous claw. Arthur tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body froze, the fear gripping him with an icy hand. The figure in the mirror pulled itself out of the glass, stepping into the room as though it were emerging from another dimension. The creature, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque amalgamation of human and something far darker. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, its eyes wide and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grin that could only be described as something born of pure malice. It moved toward Arthur with a deliberate slowness, as though savoring the moment. Arthur's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the creature's clawed hand was now inches from his face, and the room seemed to close around him. The coldness was unbearable now, seeping into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. "You came looking for answers," the creature hissed, its voice echoing in his mind. "But some things are better left unknown." In one swift motion, it reached for him, its fingers curling around his throat. The world spun, the room twisting into a nightmare of shifting shadows. He gasped for breath, but the grip was too strong. The creature's grin widened, and Arthur's vision blurred. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature let go. Arthur collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up, and the creature was gone. The mirror, too, was now empty, its surface smooth and unbroken. For a moment, Arthur lay still, unsure of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it a hallucination brought on by the house? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. He was no longer alone. He scrambled to his feet, the fear surging through him as he stumbled toward the door, only to find it once again sealed shut. The room was now silent, save for the soft hum of the mirror, which seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Arthur's mind raced. He had to escape, but there was no way out. The house had claimed him, as it had claimed so many others before him. And as the blue light from the mirror washed over him, he knew one thing for certain. Greystone Manor was not just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was hungry. Arthur's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away from the mirror, every instinct screaming at him to flee. But the house, that relentless, unfeeling entity, seemed to shift in response to his fear. The walls seemed to pulse, the very air thick with something unnatural. The mirror, no longer a reflection of reality, felt like a portal to something far darker, something beyond this world. It called to him, its surface rippling like water, as if beckoning him to come closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled toward the door, his eyes flicking between the mirror and the empty space beyond. The door remained sealed, its once solid frame now nothing more than a twisted, shifting outline. Arthur reached out, his fingers brushing against the door frame, but there was nothing to grasp. It was as though the door itself had become part of the walls, swallowed by the manor's dark magic. He was trapped. The sense of suffocation grew as he turned toward the only other way out, the stairs leading up to the second floor. But something stopped him. It wasn't just the fear gnawing at his mind. There was something else, something far worse. He could hear it now, soft whispers, as though the house itself was breathing. The air around him seemed to pulse with energy, and the room, once familiar, was now filled with an unnatural tension. Arthur's eyes darted back to the mirror. The blue glow pulsed, the light shifting and warping. The figure had returned. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was watching him. Its hollow eyes gleamed with something cold, something predatory. Its twisted smile was no longer a silent grimace. It moved, its mouth opening as though to speak. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, low and guttural, as though it came from somewhere deep within the house. The words didn't come from the mirror itself, but from the very walls surrounding him. It was as though the manor was speaking to him through the creature. Arthur felt his body freeze. His mind raced with the growing horror of what he had discovered. The creature in the mirror, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, or at least it had been real at some point. It was something that had been trapped within the walls of the manor, something that had been feeding off the terror and curiosity of those foolish enough to enter. And now, Arthur had become part of that cycle. His knees felt weak as the room seemed to shift around him. The shadows twisted, stretching toward him like claws. The whispers filled the air, growing louder until they became deafening. The house was alive, and it was closing in. The mirror beckoned him, its surface now a swirling vortex of light and dark, a portal to whatever nightmare lay beyond. The air was thick, suffocating, and as Arthur struggled to move, he realized that something was pulling at him, something invisible yet undeniable. It was as if the house had claimed him, and now it was drawing him in. His feet felt heavy, as though the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. His breath quickened, his pulse racing in panic as he tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in this nightmare, bound by some ancient, unyielding force. And then, through the haze of terror, a voice, sharp, clear, and unmistakable, spoke directly into his mind. "You were never meant to leave." Arthur's heart stopped as he looked up. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a grotesque reflection. It had stepped out of the glass, its form taking shape in the room before him. The creature was impossibly tall, its body a twisted, unnatural blend of shadow and flesh. Its face, contorted with hunger, was framed by a mass of hair that seemed to writhe like snakes. Its eyes, cold, hollow, unblinking, fixed on him with a predatory stare. The creature moved slowly, its form undulating like a wisp of smoke, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. Every movement sent ripples through the air, distorting the space around it, as if the laws of reality were bending to accommodate its presence. Arthur could feel its power, its malevolent intent, as it closed the gap between them. "You think you can understand what this place is?" The creature's voice echoed in his mind, a harsh whisper that crawled beneath his skin. "You think you can uncover its secrets and walk away unscathed? No one ever has, and no one ever will." Arthur's mouth went dry. He was paralyzed, his body frozen in place by the force of the creature's presence. The air around him seemed to tighten, pressing against him from all sides. The room had become a prison, the walls closing in. The mirror no longer a mere reflection, but a gateway to something far more sinister. Suddenly, the creature lunged. But it wasn't at him, not directly. It lunged at the mirror, its form blurring and warping as it collided with the glass. The mirror shattered, the blue light splintering into 1,000 shards that scattered across the floor. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the fractured edges of the broken mirror. The creature's roar filled the air, a sound so inhuman, so filled with rage, that it rattled the very bones of the house. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. The house was silent once more, the air thick with the echo of its presence. Arthur stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, caught in the aftermath of the terror that had just unfolded. The darkness seemed to swallow the room, but in the back of his mind, a thought flickered, a desperate hope that he could still escape, that somehow this nightmare was not his end. But then the whispers returned, soft at first, like a gentle wind through the trees. They grew louder, more urgent, until they were filling the room again, swirling around him like a storm. The house was alive with the stories of those who had entered before him. And Arthur knew, deep down, that the cycle would not stop with him. The house would take him as it had taken so many others. It would feed on his fear, his curiosity, and then it would cast him aside, just as it had done with Clara, with Elias, with the countless others who had come before. He had uncovered the secret of the house, the terrible truth that no one was meant to know. But that knowledge would not set him free. It would only seal his fate. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the house began to close in on him once again. The walls seemed to pulse, and Arthur could feel himself being drawn toward the center of the room, toward the remnants of the shattered mirror. The creature's words echoed in his mind, its promise of eternity trapped within these walls, as the darkness swallowed him whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went silent. Greystone Manor had claimed yet another soul. The house was silent again. For a moment, it felt as if everything had stopped, as though the manor had simply forgotten about Arthur, or perhaps was waiting for something. His legs trembled beneath him, his mind numbed by the horrors he had witnessed. Yet, there was no escape. The whispers returned, faint at first, like distant echoes, but they grew louder. He could feel them now, wrapping around him, a suffocating presence that seemed to press against his chest, pushing out the very air he needed to breathe. His body no longer responded to his commands, paralyzed by the same terror that had claimed every soul before him. His thoughts blurred, and his vision darkened. And then, just as swiftly as the chaos had begun, the room was still. The whispers ceased. The house, for a brief moment, felt eerily calm, as if it was waiting for Arthur to make his final decision. His mind, though clouded with fear, began to understand. The house didn't just feed on curiosity or fear. It fed on the attempt to escape. Every soul that had come to Greystone Manor had tried to leave, tried to find the way out, only to be consumed by the very thing they sought to avoid. Arthur's body went limp as the darkness deepened, but he no longer struggled. He had become one with the house. His life extinguished the moment he walked through its gates. His soul, along with the countless others before him, was now lost in the twisted labyrinth of time and space that Greystone Manor had woven around them. The manor stood undisturbed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the full moon, a place of